was then carefully mummified with all of the proper oils, ointments, unguents, and enchantments fitting the most high-born of Pharaoh, to be ferried down the Duat into the afterlife. Frankly, Anubis was probably extremely confused. She is likely the most accurate mummy made in thousands of years, because we had to consult brand new mass spec data from archaeological finds and translate the wall of an ancient temple or two just to make all of the stuff we needed for the process. It was quite the experiment, and objectively, tasted awful.
Oh, my breath smells of mummy.
If you missed it, there's also a companion video over on Nebula where we took a deep dive into the hieroglyphs and recipes that we used to make Hennefer and decorate the sarcophagus. But we'll talk more about Nebula in a bit. As an added bonus, we had these instructions for how to make a mummy printed on actual Egyptian papyrus, and they're available in our store if you want one. Link below. But no pharaoh's burial would be complete without a proper tomb. And while she is lovingly displayed in our office, this cabinet is no pyramid. So, how do you build a pyramid? The same way that you eat an elephant, with a big ramp and help from some friends. All around the world, humans figured out that if you make a really big pile of rocks, it tends to stick around, and it looks very impressive for millennia, especially if you decorate it and make sure the rocks fit together really nicely. The resulting megastructures could in turn be used for any number of religious, ceremonial, or bureaucratic reasons. Maybe you put your dead in or under them, or your rulers lived at the top. Or slap a temple on top and maybe the gods will be more willing to accept your sacrifices and grant your prayers. No matter the case, there is an untold number of massive stone structures made by a variety of ancient cultures all over the world. Much like termites, get enough humans in an area and we start building really tall things, and making holes in all of your shit. The ancient Egyptians love hogging the spotlight, but the works of the Mesoamericans and even just other cultures in Africa and Eurasia built enormous structures, ranging from pyramids to ziggurats to massive towers or palaces. For some context, the Egyptians are known as the pyramid builders, and they built approximately 140 total. The Mayans, on the other hand, built literally thousands, and we're still discovering more. These ancient megastructures are different than our modern ones in that they were built with no power tools or modern materials. No hydraulic pistons, no electricity, and definitely no internal combustion engines to power machines. Instead, they had to rely on simple mechanical principles, some very clever hand tools, rock, plaster, and concrete. Oh, and wood, of course, but wood doesn't preserve as well. But with the rise of TV, and more recently podcasts and TikTok, millions of people have become convinced that certain of these incredible feats of human ingenuity were actually the result of aliens. The Egyptians and Maya are both often subject to this nonsense, and you'll have the likes of Joe Rogan and others spreading just the dumbest nonsense. And TikTok is usually a fire hose of misinformation, save for a few very hard-working creators desperately trying to debunk it all. And, of course, this is often just thinly veneered racism, as the alien theory nonsense usually only seems to be brought up when the ancient peoples weren't considered white. Funny how almost no one claims that the Romans or Greeks were incapable of what they achieved, but live in a hotter climate and suddenly people start accusing you of being incapable of stacking rocks neatly. Today, we are going to explore some of the very real technologies that were used to build the pyramids of Giza, Teotihuacan, and many other ancient marvels, and see what it would take to build Hennefer a more fitting final home. Specifically, we're going to focus on the tools and technology that ancient peoples had for extracting and shaping stone, as well as the metals and materials used to make those tools. I think conceptually the hardest part for people to grasp is how any of this was possible without power tools or modern steel, and it's often the most misunderstood part of history. Eventually, we'll make a part 2 to this video where we explore how they moved and manipulated the large blocks once they were created. But we need both more space and, frankly, more stone to make that video properly, and probably a large collection of big burly blokes to help with the process. Though the short version of that upcoming video is basically this. Get enough humans together and there's nothing we can't move with ropes, pulleys, rulers, and the correct of force. Though, if you want to help make that video happen, consider becoming a patron of the channel. If every subscriber donated even $1, it would be enough to let us make videos for many years to come. And our growing Discord community has become quite lively and fun, which patrons get to join. Of course, if you're already a patron, special thanks to you for supporting our work over the years. It really does make it easier to produce these super long videos. Anyway, our whole modern world really only exists because we as a species learned to master first iron and then steel. And now, every single product you use likely has some amount of extremely high quality steel in it. This includes scissors and knives and other tooling, but also pistons, drive shafts, springs, gears, screws, bolts, or any number of shiny stainless product. But the pyramids weren't made out of steel and glass, they were made out of rock, specifically mostly limestone, and they got that rock from as close to the building site as possible to avoid transport problems. The quarry for the Great Pyramids of Giza, for example, is directly behind them. And when you've got decades to get a project done and tens of thousands of people to help you do it, there's very little humans can't achieve. The reason that limestone was the only rock type used. Everything from marble or alabaster to hard granite and even jade could be worked into incredibly intricate forms. And ancient peoples all around the world used these stones to make artwork that is still breathtaking to this day. But how did they do it? Well, the nice thing with rock is that if you have a second rock that is as hard or harder than the first one, congratulations, you are capable of shaping that first rock. Just smash them together and you can break little bits off. And don't forget, rocks are also abrasive, so rubbing one against another can produce a very fine finish and give you even more fine control over the shape of the rock. There's a reason that we still use stones for sharpening our tools. Sure, we've added a motor, but a grinding wheel is still just a spinning rock. And I have a collection of special stones just for sharpening my cooking knives. This long one is literally ruby, and this other one is a chunk of jade. In Stone Age societies, diorite, a very hard kind of granite, was especially prized for making tools out of, as a hammer made from it would work very well for quarrying limestone and last a long time without breaking. And axes or adze will stay sharp for a long while allowing a thinner blade compared to other rock types. And of course, flint and obsidian were also highly prized for tool making. You also don't need large chunks of rock. Rather, by making them into an abrasive powder, you can use sticks or other tools to rub the powder and sand away material. Remember, it's not the paper that makes sandpaper work. The paper is just for convenience. Though we'll talk more about this in a moment, as it is way more important than it may initially sound. If literally your only job all day is to sit there whacking away at one stone with another or slowly sanding in the fine details, you can not only make a lot of progress, but will have remarkable control over the shape of the block that you carve. However, even during the construction of the Great Pyramids in around 2500 BCE, the Egyptians weren't limited to stone tools. Instead, the Bronze Age had begun hundreds of years earlier. But it wasn't just the Egyptians. Cultures all over the world were also well within the Bronze Age at that point. And before that, starting as early as 7500 BCE, many cultures had already learned to work with copper. So they'd been using metal for millennia already. Copper is actually one of a few metals that can be found in its pure elemental form in nature in reasonable quantity. It, along with gold, silver, and platinum group metals, can be found in what are called native deposits. So you don't even need to understand smelting ore to find and use it initially. People would either find some in a stream or sticking out of a bit of exposed ground and end up digging out large chunks of metal. These could be directly shaped through repeated annealing of the metal and then bashing on it, and eventually people figured out that you could melt and cast it into even more intricate shapes. When we think of native cultures in the Americas, though, we're taught to think of them as purely Stone Age societies, but that's not accurate. Near the Great Lakes in what is now Canada and the US is the largest native copper deposit in the world. So for thousands of years, what was called the Old Copper Culture or the Old Copper Complex made tools and decorations out of copper almost exclusively. They also traded that copper all over the continent. They happened to exist in a really weird location that had huge amounts of native copper, but terrible quality stone. So making tools from copper was just the logical solution. Ironically, the abundance of native copper actually prevented them from learning how to smelt ore. They treated copper like a sort of weird rock, so never learned how to take that next step and convert it to bronze. As far as we can tell, in the north of North America, they never melted or cast the copper, and exclusively reshaped native copper chunks. But even then, the range of tools and pieces they made were astounding. And eventually, they set up trade networks spanning the continent to import better stone, and then trade that copper far and wide. However, down in South America, the Inca had figured out not only smelting copper, but also bronze. And since they had some of the richest gold and silver mines on Earth, they also made extensive use of precious metals. These ideas had begun to spread north, and smiths in West Mexico were smelting copper and even using lost wax casting techniques imported from South America. And by the time of the Spanish contact, even the Aztecs had developed some bronze metallurgy through the conquest of areas to the south and west that already had it. Truly, the Bronze Age was beginning properly on both continents, so had the timing of history worked out differently, the Americas would have looked very different at the moment of first contact. Closer to Egypt is one of the oldest known copper mines in the Timna Valley of what is now Israel, and it was in use since around 6000 BCE. However, this deposit didn't have nearly as much native copper, and most of the material was as various copper ores. The nice thing is that copper ores are actually really easy to spot if you know what you're looking for, so it's relatively easy to find an outcropping and then chase the vein. Copper ores are also relatively soft and therefore easy to mine. Unlike native copper though, you do then have to put in the effort to actually smelt the ore if you want metal. Thankfully, copper is an easy element to smelt and requires little more than a clay crucible and a campfire. Allow me to demonstrate. As we discussed in our recent iron video, setting fires inside a commercial building is generally a no-no. So we're going to be using an electric metal melter, which is actually going to be slower and more difficult than if we were doing this with a campfire. We picked up this beautiful piece of malachite, and rather than smash it, we also picked up some powdered stuff. Malachite is one of many copper minerals that have been mined over the years. Its chemical composition is just copper carbonate, so its processing is really easy. It's also ridiculously pretty, so of course the curious human is going to grab the weird green rock. Now, you do need to be careful when buying this, because our first batch turned out to be colored acrylic plastic that was sold as lab-made malachite, which is bullshit. It's horrible plastic that burns with stinking fumes to nothing but black ash. The real irony is that in a video about ancient copper, we literally got EA Nasired. And I'll be sure to make sure my review is just as scathing, though maybe not on clay. Our second attempt with actual malachite worked much better. You can see that the initial step of the carbonate cooking off blackens the powder as it forms copper oxide. But importantly, there are no horrible fumes this time. All that should be coming off is carbon dioxide. As this goes on, the powder reduces in size and begins to sinter, or stick together a little. Once we deemed it was well cooked enough, we dumped it out into a tray. This way we could mix in a similar amount of charcoal powder and then get everything back onto the heat. The charcoal is going to burn and release carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. These can react with the copper and rip the oxygen off, leaving pure metal, while also preventing outside oxygen getting in and turning it all back into copper oxide. When everything had cooked, we poured out as much liquid metal as we could, and then dumped the rest into a bucket of water. This made it really easy to separate out the charcoal, which floats and leaves clean metal behind. It's mostly tiny beads, so all of this needed to get remelted together to be usable. As you can see, this is not rocket surgery. It's practically caveman easy bake. And humans are curious and would certainly notice if their campfire accidentally turned their weird green rock into shiny copper metal. Once this process was understood, it was only a matter of time before somebody figured out the upgrade. At some point, or rather a few times throughout history, some clever human figured out that if you melt copper and then add in a certain percentage of these weird-looking, unusually heavy black rocks, instead of the usual red-orange of copper, the metal will cool to a beautiful golden color, and the result was eventually called bronze. Those weird black rocks are called cassiterite and are the main ore of tin. To show you just how easy this is, let's make some bronze. I weighed out 500 grams of copper scrap that we've saved from various machining projects, and I also bought some high-purity tin ingots to stand in for cassiterite. This was my first time holding a sample of tin, and I was not prepared for just how heavy these little nuggets are. But that's what happens when you have an element that's an entire row lower on the periodic table. And the ore is just as weirdly heavy. Anyway, we got our metal melting furnace set up again, and then slowly fed in the copper. This took a few rounds of shoving it in, letting it melt, and then adding more. Once the full charge had been added and liquefied, we scooped off any slag and plopped in our tin nugget. We gave it a couple of minutes to dissolve, then gave it a quick mix and could pour it out directly into a preheated mold. After quenching some water to quickly cool it off, because we're wildly impatient, we were left with some stunningly beautiful golden bars. These ingots can either be cold worked or melt and cast into whatever shape you want. And the best part is that now that the alloy is made, its melting point is even lower, so an even colder fire can be used to work with it. Now, you can't quench harden bronze the way that you do with iron. Even if you try, the material doesn't harden. However, you can work harden many copper alloys, bronze included. This means that when you whack a bit of bronze, it literally stiffens, and if you do that to the edges, you can end up with a surface that stays sharp much longer. But during the Bronze Age, there was actually another kind of bronze that used a different mineral, and the resulting alloy cooled to a beautiful silver color. That mineral was one of several ores of arsenic. This gives what was called arsenical bronze, and while the process of making it was extremely toxic, the end result was a bronze that was even harder and stronger, and perfect for toolmaking. While this may seem insane to a modern viewer that knows just how toxic arsenic is, in the past, humans used arsenic for all kinds of stuff. Some arsenic ores are very brightly colored, and come in shades of red, yellow, and orange. The red-orange one was called realgar, and the more yellow one was orpiment. And at least some viewers that watch the Apothecary Diaries just had their ears perk up. In the past, arsenic ore was used for paint, wallpaper, and makeup. And even today, there is still a custom of adding some to wine in China for certain festivals. It also used to be sprinkled around the house to repel animals or insects, which is a very classic human thing. Take poison, spread it everywhere, and then make a surprise Pikachu face when it inevitably makes you sick. Animals are even harder and stronger, and perfect for toolmaking. While this may seem insane to a modern viewer that knows just how toxic